Well, there's no doubt that we live in a society that's very fast-paced and where it's required of just about of anybody to be people who are able to multitask because there are so many things going on. One of the things that you might hear from a lot of people is that they say that I am just so busy, and people are just running around and running around and running around. And so there isn't much time for rest in a lot of these people's lives. Now, we might see that from people of the world, but I think that you see the same thing going on with many Christians in the church today. And just like people in the world, I think people in the church can really fail to embrace what matters the most. Now, what is that thing that matters the most? Well, we're going to talk about that as we open up Scripture and study what the Word of God says. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Well, again, like I said, I think there isn't any denying it. Again, like I said, that we live in a very fast-paced society, a very fast-paced culture, a society and a culture where everybody seems to just be on the go all the time, and it's been like that for a while. And it's very interesting. A while back, I was kind of thinking back to when I was growing up as a kid, mainly as in my teenage years, and maybe even a little bit younger than that, and just doing just thinking about how life was for me back then, and how things are for kids that are that age now, how things are for them now. And I remember just thinking, like, I was involved in some things in middle school and high school and everything. It's not like I wasn't involved in anything, but even with those things, there was still a sense of rest. There was still a sense of quietness. And so I wanted to get another opinion on this. So I called back home, and I was just going to ask whoever picked up the phone, whether it was my mom or my dad. And my mom was the one who ended up picking up the phone. And so I asked her, is it my imagination, or was life, when me and my brother were growing up, was life at a much slower pace? I mean, just as far as raising us, having the household together and everything, was it much more slower pace now than it is today? And she says, "Oh yeah, absolutely it is." And I was like, okay, that's kind of how I feel too. And it left me wondering how we got to this point. And I had certain interesting thoughts that came up in my mind. With the rise of technology, I think that's a big thing. The rise of technology, the rise of the internet, cell phones, texting, that sort of thing. These were things that I think a lot of people saw as things that were supposed to make life easier. And don't get me wrong, in many, many ways, they do make life easier. But I think that they were also seen as ways that were supposed to give us more time to do things, the more important things. Because it sped up the process of whatever we were doing and that sort of thing. And I think the exact opposite happened. And I don't have time to really go into talking about why I think that is or how I think that happened. But the unintended consequence, I think, is that in many people's lives, the advent of a lot of those things actually made us more busier. Or made us busier, not more busy, made us busier than it was intended to. And so that's why I think that you see the things that you see, I mean, just as far as our society today and why people are just so busy. And, like I said, at the beginning of this program, it's interesting that you see that in the world today, but you also see that in a lot of Christian homes. In homes where I think that if there should be a sense of rest and peace and time, good quality time, especially as a family unit, and as just having time to teach your kids things. If there was ever a place where you would want to see that, I would think that it would be in the Christian home. But in a lot of Christian homes today, people are just so busy. Even with other Christians that I know and that I've talked to, there's always the talk of, me and Lisa and the kids, we're just so busy. We're just all over the place. And we come home and we got just warm up something real quick in the microwave for dinner. We scarf things down and before we have to send Johnny off to this place and then Suzanne off to this place and then I got to go to this and it's just like and people will say we just don't have any time for anything. And there's part of me that just kind of thinks, man, there's just something that just doesn't seem right about that. I'm not saying don't be involved in stuff. I mean, it's okay, to be involved in certain things. But I mean, if we've crowded ourselves into a world where we're just on the go all the time, from a Christian perspective, I just think that there's just something funky about that. And it's. And again, I look at how things are now, how people live now, and I just think about how I lived as a kid growing up. And really, actually, you know what? You want to know the truth about it, just from my own heart and from my own spirit. I long for those days. I miss those days. I think I grew up in a good time where I was active in some things, but I also had time for peace and rest and, even some of the important things like homework and things like that. So it's just like, I wish we could go back to that time. I wish we, at least the concept of being slower paced as a society, I wish we could go back there. Because the truth of the matter is that now we live in an age where there's so many things in your face that for the Christian, there are certain things that just crowd out what is most important in our lives. The things that are most important. Now, I want to clarify what that means for the Christian, because I think for any Christian saying be sure not to crowd out what is most important. Some people might say, okay, yeah, the things that are most important, church and Bible studies, and yes, that's true, that is true. But I'm not even talking about that necessarily, because even that can turn into a busy sort of thing where that's just one list on our busy things that we need to do. And even in that, there is no peace and rest. Now, truth be told, I think that people are very busy that they don't find time or have time to spend with other believers or in community or fellowship or something. And that is a problem. But I want to go even beyond that. As important as those things are, I want to go beyond that. Okay. And so that's what I want to talk about. Today. I want to talk about embracing what matters most. Okay. That's really what I want to hit on. And the text that I want to use, the text that I want to draw from in this, it comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Okay. And this is a story about two women named Mary and Martha. I'm pretty sure that if you're familiar with Scripture, that you're familiar with those two women, or at least are knowledgeable of them or have heard of them before. They're also mentioned in places like John chapter 12. They were from a village called Bethany, and Luke isn't very detailed as far as where this whole thing takes place, but compared with other scriptures, that this is probably taking place in Bethany. And you have two sisters here, and as it says here, let me just read the passage. It's a short passage, so it's not like it's just going to take like a minute or two just to read it here. But in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42, this is what you have. Now it says, "Now as they went on, Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha. I can't read today for some reason. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's been a long day. Let me start over one more time. Okay, verse 38 of Luke chapter 10. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house, and she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Okay, so there you have just this short scenario, the short story in the midst of the book of Luke. And at first glance, you might wonder, why did the Holy Spirit lead Luke to insert this particular account here in his gospel? I mean, when you're just reading through it, at first glance may seem to be out of place. It just seems to be a random story that Luke just decides to tell. Oh, by the way, let me tell you about this whole thing with Mary and Martha and what Jesus said and everything. But I think this is an entryway into what you would see as you read on in the book of Luke, as you start to get more and more exposed to the words of Jesus in his teaching, and this may be just being an indication of the Holy Spirit leading Luke, inspiring Luke to write down and to show in this account how important it is to be listeners to Jesus Christ himself. And really, and as far as the immediate context and the immediate situation of this whole thing, highlighting the fact that it's really, really important to have your ears and your hearts open to the things of God and what God says and what Jesus Christ himself is saying to us, and what he's saying to you and what he's saying to me. And so I think that that's really what you have there, just as far as the purpose of this account being put at this particular point in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so you basically have three characters: Mary, Martha, and Jesus. I think that you probably have other people that are on the scene as well at Martha's house. I say that because when Jesus is at Martha's house, he is teaching, and I don't think this was just a one-on-one thing between him and Mary. Jesus was used to teaching in houses and taught small groups or even larger groups, in other places, and some of those places included people's houses and people's homes. And it wouldn't have been unusual for that to happen. This whole thing of Martha welcoming Jesus into her home, and then other people being there may have been an indication that she was putting on this dinner party, so to speak, in Jesus's honor. You can tell that Martha is very excited to have Jesus there, and there was a closeness between Jesus and Martha and Mary, who, by the way, they are sisters of Lazarus, right? And so you get that sense from the book of John that Jesus had a very close relationship with these folks. And so when they come into this village, Luke introduces Martha, says, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Now you got to understand about hospitality back in those days. I mean, and again, I think I've mentioned this before, just how I've experienced this when I've gone to different countries out in the East, is that hospitality towards guests is a very, very highly important thing. I mean, you have people that will go out of their way to make sure that you are comfortable, to make sure that you're well fed. They will serve and they will serve and they will serve, and sometimes they will go above and beyond what you as if I'm talking to an American, what might expect. We go to other people's houses and people serve us and people serve as hosts to us and things like that, and there's a certain degree of hospitality. But really, when you compare, there is a stark difference. At least this is how I see it, just having had my foot in both camps. And I'm not saying that hospitality as expressed here in the West or in the United States is bad or is lackluster or anything like that. I'm happy to spend time at people's houses who invite me over, and I'm grateful for what they do. I don't look at them and say, you could have done better. I mean, it's just a matter of culture. And so from an Eastern perspective and culture, I mean, we have to understand that hospitality, well, we might say hospitality here. You ask somebody here, is hospitality important? They might say yes. You ask somebody in the East, they'll say absolutely yes. So this was a very important thing. And you even see clues about this in the Bible, just in other different accounts of people going out of their way to make sure that a guest that comes to their house is welcomed and well fed and kept safe. Those sorts of things. And so when Martha invites Jesus into her home as a guest, understanding that culturally serving the guest in the best way possible was truly, truly important. And so that might give us a little bit of an indication, a little bit of an understanding of why Martha was the way that she was. Just given how important hospitality was, or serving other people, serving your guests, how important that was in that culture. And especially if we go along the lines of thinking that would say that there are other people at the house besides Jesus himself as a guest. You're not only trying to satisfy one guest, you're trying to satisfy several others as well. Okay. And, you want to go out of your way and make sure that all of them are comfortable as well. So, that being the case, Martha, would be one who is very concerned that everything is just so, that everybody is comfortable, that the food is served right, that people are well fed. And so there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of preparation that would go into something like this. So what Martha is doing is not in any way unusual at all for that culture. But here's the problem, though. You have her sister Mary. Now Mary is there. Now, whether Mary and Martha lived together, which would thus obviously make her part of the preparation, the responsibilities of preparations and stuff to fall on her shoulders too, or whether she lived somewhere else in the village, not too far away, and she came over and was going to help Martha out in hosting Jesus and some of the other people. I would imagine that even the disciples are there. So even if we're talking about other people, we have at least the disciples there probably as well, and in addition to some other people perhaps. If you're thinking about this in the sense that Mary is supposed to have some responsibility in serving the guest as well. And given what we now know about how important it was to be a good host or a good hostess when you had guests inside your house, you see the perfect setup here for what we saw in the text, with Martha being very upset with Mary, because Mary is there, and instead of being in the kitchen and preparing the food and doing every manner of things that are done to make sure that the guests are happy and are satisfied and comfortable, there you see Mary sitting at the Lord's feet and listening to his teaching. That's what the text says. Now, sitting at the feet, that you have to understand that in that culture, that was the position of somebody who was a learner, and especially when we're talking about somebody who's is there up front. You have to be up front in order to sit at the feet of somebody. You're dealing with somebody who is very attentive to what the speaker, the teacher, whoever they are, whoever's teaching at that time, very attentive to what they're saying. Okay, but so you have a very intent listener who is in the position of a learner, sitting at Jesus' feet, just like any other disciple would sit at the feet of a rabbi or a master or something like that. So you get the sense that Mary was one who was really enthralled with Jesus and just what he said. Now, obviously, because I just read the text to you, we don't know what Jesus was teaching. There are a lot of cases in the scriptures where it just says that Jesus taught, and we don't know what he taught. But I mean, whatever it was, I mean, if it's coming out of the mouth of Jesus, we know that it has to be good. Okay, we know that whatever is coming out of his mouth, it's good, it's perfect, it's valuable. You might even imagine that people who are very attentive to the words of Jesus and really implanting those words in their hearts might have the same inward reaction as the two men on the road to Emmaus may have had, after they realized that they had been with Jesus. They said, was not our hearts burning when he was speaking the word to us, right? So Martha was just in a very good position, and in a lot of ways I kind of envy her. And that's not to say that I don't think that God or Jesus can teach me today. He certainly can and certainly does. But what was it like? What was it like to have that front row seat and just sit there at the feet of Jesus and just listen to him speak? That's just an amazing thing. And so in a way, I kind of envy her. but she was in a good spot. She was in a good position, and she's listening to and listen to his teaching. Okay. So then we get to the whole thing in verse 40. It says, but Martha was distracted with much serving. And I just want to point out by saying here that Martha's desire to serve other people is not bad. Her serving other people and her doing the things that she was doing in and of themselves are not bad. They're not wrong. It's not wrong to serve your guests, obviously. It's not wrong to have a desire to make sure that they're as comfortable as possible, right? Serving other people in that capacity is not what's wrong. It's not wrong. But the key word, at least there in verse 40 there, the first part of verse 40, it says, but Martha was distracted. Now, I want you to underline that word in your mind because I think that that's where many people are today. I mean, if we're trying to make parallels between what we see in the text that we're looking at here and even what goes on today, both inside and outside the church, I mean, we don't expect much from people on the outside, obviously. So let's leave them out. Let's talk about what goes on within the fellowship, within the church, with Christians in their lives and in their homes and everything like that. Could it be said that for many Christians and for many Christian households, that people are distracted by so many things? I think that you can say, yeah, that we are distracted by so many things. I mean, if we're talking about a society where a lot of people are saying, man, I am just so busy. I am so busy. I mean, you gotta understand, people stress. We are just so busy. We don't have time for anything. We kind of think, okay, does in all of the things that are clustered in your life, in your life, are there things in there where you are able to adequately and sufficiently embrace the most important things? And I do think that for many of those people who confess that they're so busy, they would answer, no, I don't make room, or I don't have room for those things that are most important. And so I think one would legitimately be able to say that there are a lot of things in people's lives that serve as a distraction. Now, I understand that, given different people, different situations, there are certain things that are just unavoidable. They are. I mean, I just think about a single mother who's trying to work to make ends meet, and she's working all the time, and she has to in order to just sustain a decent level of sustainability for her and her kids or something like that. I understand, things like that. We're just talking about things where we just put so many things in our lives that crowds out everything else that's most important, right? We crowd out those things. And so sometimes when people say, man, I'm just so busy, and some people will confess, I don't have time, to spend time with other Christians. I don't have time to spend time with God. I don't have time to commune with him in prayer. The question is, what sort of things are you putting in your life that crowds those things out? Are they really that important that you would legitimately be able to say that I have to do these things, and sorry, the things on the spiritual end, the things that have more to do with eternity, have to take a back seat to everything. Some people say that they're just too busy for things, but it's just a matter of the choices that we make. There are certain choices that we make. We choose to get involved with certain things. We choose to allow certain things to happen. And so it's just, what are our choices? What are the choices that we are making? And isn't it interesting that whenever there's a crowding of so many things, and something has to be left out, it's the spiritual things that get left out, right? Now, listen, a lot of those other things that we're busy with, and it just fill up a lot of much of our schedule books. Just like with Martha in her serving, a lot of those things, are things that aren't in and of themselves wrong or bad. And in fact, in some places, at certain seasons and at certain times, maybe those things have their place. And I'm certainly not one who would say that that these people need to drop everything and fill everything 100% with Bible studies and church and things like that. I'm not saying that either. But I think we do have to evaluate, and I say we because a lot of times I have to evaluate things on my end too. And I have to really guard against, not letting things get out of hand with things. We just have to evaluate and just saying what is important, what is not important, what can I do without, and what are some of the things that I absolutely need. And sadly, for a lot of Christians, the things that they say they absolutely need, in all reality, let's be honest, are things that you don't need. Now, again, I understand that in some cases there are certain exceptions, so I don't want to make a broad statement on that. But in many cases, the things that we say, this is absolutely something that we need to do, in all reality, isn't really anything that we really need. I mean, if we sat down and thought about it for like 2 seconds, I think we come to that realization, right? And I'm not even going to say that some of the things that make up the things that we do in our life aren't important. But again, what does that say about what we think is most important? Everything that we might be dealing with might be important to a certain degree. But if the most important thing is being put on the back burner, then you're not doing anybody any favors. And so that's the thing. It was important for Martha, and I guess when you look at it from a cultural sense, maybe you think this is true. It's okay that in Martha's case, it was important for her to serve. And listen, there was nothing wrong with that. But the thing is, while the Son of God, God in human flesh, was under her roof and speaking words of life, and just really just speaking wisdom, godly wisdom, because he himself is God. That really wasn't anything where she really even paid attention to that. And so what was most important to her got the most attention, which was running around, serving, and doing all those things. And that's what's occupied her heart. That's what occupied her mind. So when God is speaking, and I don't think that Martha was ignorant of who she had under her roof. She knew who was under her roof. And yet, there's this whole thing where she was distracted so much that even with what she was doing, she could not pause to hear the words of Jesus being spoken in her house. Okay. Now, part of what might have been going on with her, not only just the general sense of wanting to be one who was hospitable in that culture, but again, if we go back to the thought of Martha had a good idea of who she was dealing with and who was under her roof, that may have amped things up a little bit. I mean, really, put yourself in her sandals. Put yourself in her sandals. If Jesus Christ were here bodily today, and he was a guest at your house, wouldn't you, be honest here, wouldn't you kind of put a little bit of extra energy and effort into your hosting and into your serving and everything like that? I mean, because this is Jesus in your house, right? Jesus has entered the building. And so I'm pretty sure that there would be many of us Christians who would be deeply concerned that everything was just so. That nothing went wrong, that we didn't burn the bread, that we didn't, that everything was perfect, because we say the Son of God deserves perfection from us, and everything. And so we might be just along with Martha, going here and there because of who we're serving. Now, obviously, that's not a reality that we can relate to today, but in a certain sense, we can relate to things in the sense that some of the busyness. Now, if we take the whole thing of looking at busyness in the Christian life from another perspective, it might be the fact that we busy ourselves with so many spiritual things, quote unquote spiritual things, church things, fellowship things. And we can still miss out on what is most important. That's why I said I want to go beyond the whole thing of asking ourselves, do we have enough time for spending time with other Christians and fellowship and everything like that? And again, I'm not saying that's not important. It is, but I want to go beyond that, because it is possible for people to even be engaged in that and still not embrace what is truly important. And that just depends on what your motivations are and everything. But people can be busy and bogged down with some of the more spiritual things and still miss the point. Now, the spiritual things that you do are okay. But what drives you? What's in the heart? What's in your heart? What drives you? This is a question that a lot of pastors have to ask. And I know that I've talked about this before, but you have a lot of pastors who just burn themselves out. And somebody might look at them and they might look at how busy they are and say, man, he's just on fire for the Lord. He's working for the Lord. Is he really? Is he though? Now, obviously, I can't make a determination just by looking at people because I can't see inside their heart. But I think that there are a lot of pastors, there are a lot of ministers out there who burn themselves out because they're trying to jump through all sorts of hoops of the congregation or trying to please people. You have a lot of pastors who are people pleasers. And they're doing all these things that they're not even equipped or called to do. But people look at that and say, oh, look at him. He's just doing all these things for the Lord. Well, maybe, but in other cases, he might just be trying to please people. Could be. Sometimes people of the pastoral persuasion get so bogged down that you'll have some that will admit and they'll say, I don't even have time to be in the Word or to pray. That's a problem, folks. That's a huge problem. That is a case in point from a leadership perspective, where somebody in that position is not embracing what is most important. Hands down, that is a good example of that. When you have pastors who are able to say, "I don't have time for prayer," that's a problem, and that needs to get fixed pretty quickly. But my point is that even with the things that from a spiritual perspective are very good things, even in those things, we can miss the point. So we can have Jesus under our roof, to kind of use the analogy, and serve in a way so that we can make sure that everything is just so, but we still miss the point. We're distracted. We're distracted by what's most important. I keep saying what's most important, and I'm going to get to that here in a couple of minutes. But for now, let's observe here. We know what we've kind of hopefully spent an adequate amount of time in Martha's sandals. We see that she's distracted, okay? She's allowed all of this to distract her from what's most important. You get a sense of how frustrating this is by what we continue to see there in verse 40. It says, and she went up to him, to Jesus, and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Now, I think that this is a very interesting part of this scene here. Very interesting, because you get a sense. Here's how you can get a sense of Martha's frustration. Her frustration is to a point where when she approaches Jesus about this, she approaches him by saying, Lord, do you not care? Now, wow. Lord, do you not care? Which really shows you the confidence that Martha had, that she was in the right and that her sister Mary was in the wrong. And so from her perspective, she's seeing Mary just sitting there drinking in all the words that Jesus is saying, and she's looking on that and saying, Mary is wrong. She needs to be helping me instead of leaving me with all these tasks to do. And so she's confident that she's in the right. And what's more, she goes to the person, and this is again plays into the whole thing of how we know that Martha understands who she's dealing with, because she doesn't confront Mary, interestingly enough. She goes to Jesus, who she addresses as Lord, and as somebody who is Lord over her and her sister, she appeals to him and says, look, you have the authority to tell her to help me, which is a very interesting thing to appeal to Jesus to, right? Even understanding his authority and everything. We're talking about the God of the universe, and we come to Jesus and say, tell her to help me with the housework and the preparations and the food and that sort of thing. It's just a very interesting sort of thing. But the fact that Martha sees all of this and Jesus isn't saying anything or doing anything, it's just really elicits this whole thing from her where she just says, "Don't you care?" Because if Jesus isn't addressing the issue, in Martha's mind, it's almost as if he doesn't care that she's not helping out. And she thinks that she should be. So that's, Martha's like, that's a problem. So it's interesting that she says that. It's interesting that she doesn't, just pull Mary aside, because she could have done that, I would imagine, and saying, "Look, I'm way in over my head with stuff. I need your help, please." But she doesn't do that. She goes to Jesus and says, "Hey, give her the order. Give her the order to help me out here. Have her, at the very least, have her dress a salad or something. Do something to help me. Pitch in a little ways, but don't have her just sitting here doing nothing." Martha may have looked at this where she thought that Mary was being lazy. I mean, I don't know. The text doesn't say. I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe that's another thing that she was thinking about this whole thing. But she comes up to Jesus and says, "Do you not care? Don't you care, Lord, that my sister," and listen to how, just kind of how woe is me. It says, "Don't you care that my sister has left me to serve alone? I'm all by myself. I need help. And she's left me alone. Don't you care? Look upon my plight, oh Lord." Just kind of, maybe it wasn't that dramatic, but I mean, you see how she's centering the attention on herself and her plight, kind of like, "Oh, look at me. She's left me alone. Tell her to help me. Woe is me." Don't you care that she's left me here alone? And in a way, just kind of answering the question again, going back to the whole thing of saying, "Lord, don't you care that da 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 da." He's also questioning her, questioning his care about her well-being. "Lord, do you care about me? Because you don't seem to be intervening in this whole thing where I'm definitely in the right, and you're not saying anything. Do you care about me, that I'm left to do all of these things alone?" I mean, what gives? And I wonder what she would have, it's hard for me to think that Martha would have expected Jesus to say, "Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Mary, go help out your sister." I mean, is that really what she expected? I mean, maybe she did, but I mean, it's just like, it's just funny to think about when you look about it. Look at it from that lens. And I think Martha expected, Jesus, to have Jesus say, "You know what, Mary, your sister's right. Go and help out your sister." And I think that was the expectation. And I don't think the expectation was the answer that Martha got from the Lord Jesus himself, which is what you see in verses 41 and 42. Where it says, "But the Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things.'" Now let's just stop right there for a moment. And does anybody else, and this is just my quirky sense about me, but does anybody, whenever you read Martha, Martha, do you think the Brady Bunch and Marsha, Marsha, Marsha? I mean, I inevitably think that. But I mean, anyway, but Martha, Martha, kind of like, "Oh, Martha, 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 you are anxious and troubled about many things." Now listen, we saw before, the word distracted, and that's one term that we use, that we underline to describe Martha's state of being here. We get a little bit more of an enhanced view of this by what Jesus himself says. He says, "You are anxious." Where does it say here? "You are anxious and troubled about many things." So this was really getting to her. Have you ever been anxious about something? I mean, really, when you're anxious about things, when you have anxiety over something, that's I mean, we're talking about something that it's really affecting you, whatever that issue, whatever that situation might be. Whether it's money issues, relationship problems, or whatever. People are anxious about so many things. This whole situation here, this whole scenario was causing anxiety in Martha. And if you've ever seen somebody who's anxious to please people, you see them running around doing this and that and just going here and there and blah, blah, blah. You know, that's kind of how she was. She was anxious because she didn't want to let everybody down. And that's why she was distracted and troubled. And obviously she's troubled because she's mad about the fact that Mary's not helping her. Now, maybe she felt like she was behind in a lot of her preparations. Maybe there are certain things as far as food preparation that wasn't going right. And she was troubled about that because that's going to set her behind the 8 ball or whatever, which would bring about her troubled spirit even more about regarding the fact that Mary isn't helping. She might be thinking, if Mary would just get up and help me, lend a helping hand, I wouldn't be in this spot. And maybe she, in her own heart, she would have less anxiety and things like that because there would be 4 hands working on things instead of just 2. But Jesus says, you know what? You are anxious and troubled about many things. But, verse 42, but one thing is necessary. Now, isn't that is just so insightful? Now think about that. The many things versus the one thing. Okay, many things, and these are the many things that Martha is distracted by. But there's only one thing that's necessary. The one thing that that Martha isn't distracted by or isn't embracing. And it's in that one thing that Jesus says only one thing is necessary. In other words, he's saying you've missed the most important thing. So how useless is that? How useless it is to be so hot and bothered about the many things, and you're hot and bothered about the many things of which which as far as importance goes pales in comparison to the one thing that you're missing. The one important thing and the one thing that is necessary. See, in Martha's mind, it might have been, it's necessary for me to do all this in order for everything to be just right. But Jesus is saying, Martha, I don't think you're in the right spot. I don't think you have this down. You're distracted by so many things. Well, again, not just distracted, but you're anxious and troubled about so many things. But you know what? Only one thing matters. Is pretty much what he's saying. But one thing is necessary. Just one. And so what's this most important thing? It's this whole thing. If we're asking the question, what is most important? Because we're talking about embracing what is most important. What's most important is Jesus himself. You can have a lot of Christians running around and with like chickens with their heads cut off, but they're not even communing with Jesus. That's a situation where people are anxious and distracted and troubled about many things, but they're not even grasping the one thing that's necessary. That's Jesus himself. People go all out of their way to do this and to do that, and in the whole thing, you have to ask, where's Jesus? Have I spent time to just be with Jesus? And this isn't a plug for, hey, you need to have your quiet time and everything like that. I'm not even talking about that exclusively. Of course, time in the Word is important, but again, we're not even just talking about that exclusively. I mean, you can just sit and rest in the presence of God. You yourself by yourself, you and your family, you as you take quality time with peace and rest to teach your kids about the things of God for His glory, and pointing them to Jesus and saying, that guy, he is important. He is the most important. Mary was one who embraced what was most important, and that was Jesus himself. And when he speaks, Mary was one who understood. The Lord is speaking. God is speaking, and I want to listen. And in our society, with a go society that we live in, and what we allow ourselves to get ultra busy with, whether it's with the spiritual things or the worldly things, however way you want to look at it here. We get so distracted that we don't even leave room in our hearts to even hear God speak. And in a lot of those cases, God might be trying to tell us something, but we can't hear him. You know why? Because we've cluttered our lives with a lot of other noise. Because we've embraced those things as the most important. Now, again, I'm not saying that you drop all of those things necessarily and you go off into the woods and become a hermit or a monk or something like that. In fact, here's what I would say about that, in the early parts of church history, and of course, even in some places today, but I mean, even when the monastic lifestyle was truly popular in the first few centuries of the church's history, you had groups, communities of people who lived in a cloister by themselves and dedicated themselves to all sorts of, serving one another and that sort of thing. Contemplation and everything like that. And there were certain things in there that was good, but I mean, I think that extreme was incomplete because they shut themselves off from the world and reaching out to people in the world. So even on the other extreme, I wouldn't say that they had it 100% right there either. But here's the point that I'm trying to make here is that for many of us, we don't leave room to hear God speak. And again, like I said, there are certain times when God might be trying to get our attention, but we're just listening to a whole bunch of other noise. And I think there's something to be said about having time, consistently. And having time, and by time, I'm not just meaning 5 minutes, a 5-minute pause, and then going out and doing the chicken with your head cut off routine again for the rest of the day. Having sufficient time just to be, whether by yourself, with your family, whatever the situation may call for, to rest with one another, rest in the Lord, be with the Lord, whether it's in prayer, whether it's in his word, whether it's just praising him, just pausing to praise him for who he is and what he's done. And hopefully, if you make that as a practice, you'll see you begin to see just how valuable that is. And in comparison to all the other things in your life, again, all those other things aren't necessarily bad, but in comparison, when you compare those things with that time where you're just in the presence of God, I mean, somebody can say you're always in the presence of God because God is omnipresent. I understand that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about where your full concentration is on him and just spending time with him and listening to him and communing with him. When that becomes your consistent practice, I think you begin to see how much more valuable that is and how that indeed is the most important thing compared to all the other things that are in your life. And once you grasp the value of that, you might begin to start saying, okay, my schedule is getting busy again. I need to drop some things. Well, it's going to be no problem for me to drop this, and this. But time with God, quality time with God, that's not going to get crowded out because I see the value of it, its importance. And that is the most important thing. All those other things, when you line those up on the scale of eternity, actually mean nothing. Now, again, let me reiterate, I'm not saying you shouldn't do those things. You can't do those things. You should drop everything that you're doing in those things. But again, it's just, listen, it comes back again just to a matter of choices. What kind of choices are we making? And a lot of times, we don't like to admit this, but a lot of times we choose to put Jesus Christ on the back burner. We do. And even with all the other things that we involve ourselves with, we don't make Jesus Christ central in even those things because he's Lord of all, isn't he? But yet he's not central in those things as well. And that's something that if that's part of our lives, if that's kind of our MO as far as how we live our lives, we need to amend that. And listen, if that's where you are, God's not up there saying, gosh, what are these people doing? He's not like that. He's patiently waiting for you. And when you come back and you say, you know what, I've failed to make the most important thing, and I'm sorry for that. He's going to receive that with open arms. But just think about this. Think about it. That what kind of choices are we making, and what sort of things do we allow to distract us? Even the things that are very good. Again, like I said, a lot of the things that serve as distractions that we allow to trouble us are things that aren't bad. They're just not the most important, though. And that's the idea. And that's what Jesus had to communicate to Martha. He says, you're troubled and anxious about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. Some translations say few things are necessary, or but only one is necessary. And it ends in the latter part of verse 42. He says, Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Man, just imagine that. Why? I wonder how Martha, because that's where the story ends. But I wonder what Martha's thought process was after listening to that. I wonder. But Jesus said, Mary has chosen the good portion of this. She's chosen what is good. She's not doing anything wrong. She hasn't chosen the bad. So here's the thing. I mean, in Martha's mind, this was a whole thing of good, helping me out, bad, just sitting there and not doing anything. Never mind, she's listening to Jesus. But she's doing the bad thing. And Jesus said, no, she chose the good portion. And by saying that she chose the good portion, again, I don't think that that's Jesus saying that it's Martha serving other people is bad. But the bad thing was that for Martha, all of this served as a distraction. Because really, I mean, listen, if Martha truly embraced just pausing and listening to Jesus and recognizing that as the most important, you realize that her situation could have been a both and. Didn't have to be an either or. She could listen to Jesus speak and then after that continue with what she's doing. And Jesus wouldn't have had any qualms with that. And you know what? I don't think anybody else who may have been there would have had any qualms with that either. I don't think so. So that's what we mean. That's what he means where he says that Mary chose the good portion. She made a right choice. And in doing that, Jesus says, I'm not gonna make her. I mean, he says that's not going to be taken away from her. So in other words, he's saying, I'm not going to say, look, you need to help out your sister because she's got so many things going on. No, Mary is sitting there and listening to the Lord himself speak words of life and truth. Things that, when measured up with eternity, are so, so important. That is the most important thing. Being with Jesus, hearing him speak, communing with him, and growing from those things. And Jesus says that is the most important. And that's not going to be taken away from her. So I hope you understand. I hope this gives you a little bit of a shift of perspective. Just ask the Lord. Listen, throughout this week, ask the Lord, where am I in all of this? Have I allowed certain things to get in the way where they crowd out what is most important? And I've made other things of life as things that are most important. Think about that. Pray about that. Be receptive to what the Holy Spirit reveals to you, and be obedient to what God tells you to do as far as how he leads you in the next steps that you need to take. Okay? And in that sense, I think you'll be in a good spot. Okay? So that's our examination for today. So we'll leave it there. If you like this show, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts. You can also access Loving the Scriptures on Google Play. You can also check out or you can follow Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, friends. I hope you enjoyed your time here as we examine Scripture. I know that I did, as I always do. I hope you come back next week as we examine more of the Bible. My name is Steve Gill, and I hope you have a good, godly, and blessed week. Bye now.